Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and in this video we're going to walk through several important aspects of modern programming in an attempt to synthesize a bunch of things that you might have learned in coding tutorials but haven't been given the opportunity to put into practice. Specifically, we'll be using GitHub to pull from and push to remote repositories, use Node Package Manager or NPM to set up our projects and handle things like automatic reloading, structure our code using JavaScript ES6 classes, and take a look at other ES6 features that can help with our workflow and development. There are a couple of prerequisites for this tutorial. For example, if you haven't already watched my video on how to set up an integrated development environment or IDE, I highly recommend that you do so, as it will help you in understanding how and why to set up things like a code editor and GitHub and a package manager and that sort of thing. Specifically in this tutorial, we'll be working with a few different things that I'm going to show you on screen here, and I'll presume that you've already installed these on your machine. The first one is Node.js, which bundles a Node Package Manager and is going to help us download our files and do some other things. I also have Git for Windows installed, as I'm working on a Windows machine, but you might use some other Git integration to make sure that we can do our version control using GitHub. I have the Git Bash command line interface installed, which comes with Git for Windows. You might have another command line interface or CLI like the command prompt or the terminal or something else. Any of those will do as long as you've integrated it with GitHub. And I'm also using Atom as my code editor. You could be using WebStorm or maybe Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or Sublime. Any of those will work. I'm just using Atom because it's pretty lightweight and will help us to do everything that we need to do today. So I'm couching all of this in the use of Phaser 3. Phaser is a 2D JavaScript-based game engine. You could be using React or Vue or some other framework or library that you want to get familiar with. Phaser is just a fun and interesting to use JavaScript framework for making games. And I have some background in it, so I'm using it as an example. But most of the things we're going to work with today will be applicable to other projects. Even if you're not working in JavaScript, there will be some things that will carry over. We will be working specifically with JavaScript code, but there are some fundamentals of programming that will still be useful to you. For example, using an integrated development environment, pushing and pulling from GitHub, that sort of thing. All of these concepts are important for you as a developer, moving from a beginner into perhaps an intermediate phase of your development. So the first thing we're going to work with is understanding what GitHub is and how we're going to pull from it and push to it, and what repositories are and why it's important for our projects. Well, I'm starting here on this Phaser 3 project template page, which is on GitHub, and it is a remote repository, meaning that it doesn't exist on my computer. It exists in the cloud somewhere on GitHub servers, which is what makes it remote. And what I want to do is I want to clone this template onto my computer, or download a version of it or a copy of it onto my computer, so that I can make a local repository, meaning a place on my computer where all of the files and information lives, so that I can make changes to it and build my project or build my program. The way that I'm going to do this is, after having installed GitHub, I'm going to click. I'm going to go to this web page, and I'm going to click Clone or Download, and I'm going to grab this URL just by hitting Copy, or I can press Control-C, however you want to do it. Then I'll navigate to my command line interface, which I mentioned is I'm using Git Bash, and I will go into my coding directory. You can keep this wherever you want. I just keep all my coding stuff in this coding directory. And I'm going to make a new directory called, let's just call it new directory, and navigate to that directory. If you're not familiar with the command line interface, you could potentially do this using your File Explorer or some other user interface. It's great to become comfortable with the command line interface, as that is the gold standard in working with a lot of these different projects. your mileage might vary with it, but I would highly recommend just looking up a quick tutorial on the basic commands you'll need to use, and you'll feel right at home. So I'm in this new directory, and if I just take a look at what's in the directory, there's nothing in it at this time because I just created it. And I'm going to say git clone, and then with git bash you just right click and hit paste, and I paste that URL, and it'll say cloning into Phaser 3 project template, and you know, nothing special happened. It just cloned all of these files and folders as well as the README into this directory. If I take a look at that directory again, I see that it now has a Phaser 3 project template directory. I'm going to navigate to that directory, cd Phaser 3 project template. I take a look at what's in the directory, and I see that it has all of the same files and folders as we have in this remote repository. So what I've done is I've cloned the remote repository into a local repository. Nothing special going on there. It's just another fancy way of saying that I've downloaded it. But now, let's say even before I get started on my project, I want to create my own remote repository so that when I make changes to my files here and I start building my project, I want to back them up to a remote repository. I want to back them up to my account on the cloud on GitHub, and maybe I want to share that code with someone else or with a team that's also going to make changes to it, and we want to have a version control system where I can make changes to specific parts of the code, and someone else can make changes to other parts of the code, but we have one source of truth, which is the remote repository that we're both sharing and coding into, we may want to roll back some features at some point, or we may want to test out some other features, like let's say we want to test out multiplayer without touching the single player code. GitHub will allow us to do that, and the first thing I need to do is create a remote repository, an empty one, to push all of this stuff into. So I'm going to go to my GitHub account, which is already open, and I'm again going to assume that you've already created a GitHub account. This is what your dashboard will look like, and you'll just click on New to create a new repository, and we'll call this one the same thing as what our folder is called. We'll call it Phaser 3 project template. And I'm not going to put a description for this, although you probably should. I'm going to make it private because I don't want anyone else to see it right now. I'm not going to initialize this repository with a README because it will save us a little bit of a headache later. I'll show you what that means. And I'll hit Create Repository. And now I have an empty repository, empty remote repository, and I want to push, or I want to send or upload all of the stuff that I just downloaded up into this this new repository. So how do I do that? Well, GitHub gives me a couple of different options here. It says that that if I want to create a new repository on the command line, I could just copy and paste all of this stuff and upload it. That's fine. Or push an existing repository from the command line. That's what I want to do because I already have an existing repository that has stuff in it. I want to push that into this new remote repository. So what I need to do is I need to copy this, or you could just highlight all this stuff and copy it, but you can press this button to copy it. And what these things do, these commands will do is they will say, hey GitHub, I want to add the origin, or essentially the remote repository, and I want that to point to this URL, this new repository that we created, and I want to push all of the stuff that's in my local repository to that origin. All this stuff that we just installed, I want to push that to this new remote repository. So this isn't going to work, and I'll show you why, but I pasted all that stuff, and it says get remote add origin, what we just copied and pasted, and it says fatal remote origin already exists. That just means that we cloned a remote repository that was this original repository here, the Phaser 3 project template. If I were just creating my own code from scratch, I probably wouldn't have this issue. So what I need to do before all this stuff is say git remote rm origin. That means remove the origin. Actually, I want to change where I'm pointing to. I want to change right now. My local repository is pointing to this original remote repository, and I'm saying, you know what, forget all that. I want to remove that because I'm going to push to a new origin. And you'll say that, it won't do you the kindness of saying, okay, I did that. It'll just go back to your regular command line. And then now you can paste what you did before and say get remote at origin, add this new remote repository, so make a binding between the two, and then push -u origin master, push everything that's on my local repository to this new origin, to this new remote repository, and then it will do just that for you. And it will show you a little bit of a dialog that says branch master set to track remote branch master from origin. You can think of, right now we'll just be working with the master branch. You can think of branches in GitHub as a way of keeping track of different feature sets or different versions or different projects, sub-projects that you're working on within a main project. We won't really be dealing with branches in this tutorial. Just know that right now we're on the master branch, and that's what we're going to work with today. So I've done that, and let's say I go away from my computer, or I stop working on the project for a couple of days, or I added someone else to the project, and I'm not sure what the status is in terms of what my local repository looks like, what the repository on my computer looks like, versus the one that's on the remote repository, the one that's on GitHub. I can just type in git status, and it'll say on branch master, your branch is up to date with the origin, nothing to commit, working tree clean. That means that nothing's changed. Everything on my local repository is on par with everything on the remote repository. That's great. And if I actually reload this page here, we'll see that it has correctly pushed everything to the remote repository, and it now looks pretty much identical to this original project that is hosted by PhotonStorm. So great, I've successfully downloaded and re-uploaded. Nothing really special has happened, but that's still a good practice to be able to clone something from GitHub and then add it to your computer, change the origin, and then push it, create a new remote repository, and then push all of the contents of your local repository to the remote repository. That's a good practice to know. Now, we're not quite ready to work yet, because if we look at the README that has been provided to us by PhotonStorm, we'll see that in the requirements section, Node.js is required to install our dependencies and run scripts via the Node package manager. That's all well and good. That just means that before we start any work, we need to type in npm install, which is going to install the dependencies or what the project needs to actually get up and running. So I'm just going to do that. I'm already in the folder, and I'm going to type in npm install, and Node Package Manager will install all the dependencies that I need for working with Phaser and building my project. And we see it gives us a little bit of information about what's happened. We're not going to pay any attention to this dialog right now. We're just going to say that, okay, it's done what we needed it to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to type in npm start, as it tells us to in the project README, and see what happens. What it's doing is it's using Webpack and in coordinates with Node to serve up a local website for us where we can see what are the fruits of our project. This is similar, if you've worked with Node at all, this is similar to just creating a simple server on your local machine and serving up the contents of a website. But what's cool about this is that it does it automatically after you type in npm start, and then it's going to automatically reload any changes that I make to my project, or it will throw an error in my console if I've done something incorrectly. So this way I don't have to load up a web server every time. I don't have to reload that server, reload that page every time. It just serves up whatever's in the project contents in a web page for you, and you don't have to do anything about it. And I'm going to open up my console because we're going to need to use that later on. I'm going to leave this running as it is, and I'm going to navigate over to my Atom code editor, and I'm going to open that project by opening folder. I'll go to my coding directory. It's already in new directory. I'll select Phaser 3 project template. And then what will happen, of course, this might look differently if you're not using Atom, if you're using a different code editor, but you'll see that you'll see all the files that you downloaded or that you pulled from or you cloned from GitHub. And you'll see that Phaser or whatever project or template that you've downloaded has created a scaffolding for what your project can look like based on the best practices of that particular framework or library. In here, I have in the root directory, I have an index.html that doesn't actually have anything in it because when you're a lot of times when you're doing development, the files that you're using for development are not what the final build would look like. Oftentimes, for example, if I navigate back to this project directory, I see, or the repository, I see that npm start, it builds the project and opens a web server running the project. But then when I type in npm run build, it will build a code bundle with production settings, including minification, uglification, etc., which means that my development build or the project that I'm using in development is not going to look exactly the same or even the same at all in terms of the file structure and the code as the production build will look like. When you type in npm run build, at least with this project, it's going to compile all that stuff into the most efficient way possible for you to use if you were going to, say, serve it up as a website. We don't have to pay attention to that right now, just letting you know while there's nothing in my index.html. And if I go to my source folder, which is a lot of times where things will live if you're working on a JavaScript or a web-based project, that's where I'll have like an assets directory. I'll have index.js, which is maybe the entry point, and it certainly is for this Phaser project. And I don't expect that you'll become an expert in Phaser or necessarily understand everything in this tutorial about what we're doing with Phaser. I'm using it more just as an example of what you could do with the project. So if some of these things don't seem perfectly natural, then just don't worry about it. We're focusing more on the structure of this and how to learn coding best practices rather than the specifics of Phaser itself. If you're interested in Phaser, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a fun to work with 2D framework for building games, and there's some good documentation out there that can help you get up and running with it. So I just want to give you an overview of what's happening here. The way that Phaser works is that there's a constant called config, which is a constant is a type of variable that basically says this object is of the type phaser.auto. Its parent is phaser-example. The height and the width and the height of the game are 800 by 600. It has a couple of scenes. Nothing really that we need to dive in here. Just to say that we're going to encounter a few different things that you may not have encountered if you're working with like web tutorials about basic JavaScript, and these are called ES6 features. I'm going to actually show you a web page that you can take a look at after watching this video, or you can just hit pause and take a look at it. If you go to w3schools.com/js/js_es6.asp, or if you just search for ES6 or ES6 features, you'll get here. It says, what is ECMA script 6? And it says it's also known as ES6, and some people call it JavaScript 6. It includes certain things that you won't find in a lot of vanilla JavaScript, such as the concept of let and constant, arrow functions, classes. There's also use of things like import and export. We'll take a look at some of those things in practice so you can get an idea of what they mean. But you might want to take a look at this page and just familiarize yourself with stuff like using let instead of declaring a variable as var x. You could just say let x equals 2, depending on your scope. If you use a constant, it allows you to declare a constant or a JavaScript variable with a constant value. Constants are similar to let variables, except that the value cannot be changed. That's pretty good. We'll look at arrow functions. We'll look at import and export, and things that you might come across if you're working with modern JavaScript frameworks. Going back to our code, what this is doing here is we're creating a config object. Like I said, we don't need to get into it at this time. And then we're creating a game, a new phaser game that's based on that config object. And what's happening here is these two functions, preload and create. In preload, we're loading an image called logo image that is based off of this right here. We're loading an image called logo image, and that comes from this logo.png, which lives in my assets folder. You can see up here at the top of the code, we have imported logo image from assets / logo.png. And then in the create function, which means for phaser, the preload fit function just means I want this to happen before the game starts. It's kind of like a staging area. And then the create function means, okay, do this when the game starts. And we're seeing that a constant logo is set as equal to adding an image, this specific image that we just created, the logo. And then there's another part, this block of code makes the image that we have rendered to do this like little hop up and down thing. We're not actually going to we're going to delete that line of code because we don't want to work with it right now. So we're just going to delete this. And if you can't see this, but I'm hitting Control S to save. And because I'm using NPM and Webpack, it now it has auto or live reloaded my game, and I just see the phaser logo without bouncing up and down. So that's what I want right now. Now, I want you to imagine that this index.js is the main entry point for your game or for your project, and you start adding things. You add other logos, you add other sprites or images, you add different user input, you add 100 or even 1,000 different lines of code. Now that can get pretty out of hand pretty quickly, not only in terms of the amount of code that you're writing in that one file, but also in the cognitive load that it takes to think about, well, where is that piece of code that I had, or I'm trying to use Control F to find it, but I'm getting hung up on other variables that I've declared, or I just have this big mess of code that's all in one file. Well, to resolve that, we're going to create different components or different what are called modules within our file system that we can then access in a modular way so that we don't have everything all in one place. We're going to have several different modules that allow us to keep code together that makes sense to keep together, and otherwise separate it from our main program so that we don't have to look at it. That's just going to make things feel a lot cleaner, and we're able to take advantage of ES6 features like import and export to do it in a really clean way. And we'll also look at JavaScript classes in the process. So none of this stuff actually, these two lines of code, or I guess it's more like 7 lines of code. These 2 code blocks, they don't need to live in this main index.js. They can live somewhere else. In Phaser, those are called scenes. In React or in Vue or elsewhere, they might be called something else in terms of how they treat their modules or components. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click in the source directory. I'm going to create a new folder called scenes, and in that folder, I'm going to create a new file, which is called game.js. And in this game.js folder, I'm going to begin my work with using JavaScript classes. Now, if you're not familiar with JavaScript classes as such, and you're coming from another programming language, you might see some similarities in the way that JavaScript handles classes in terms of its ES6 featuring. But it's they call it more syntactic sugar, a syntactic layer of sugar over what JavaScript already does with prototyping. That just means to say they're not true classes in the traditional sense if you're coming from like C#, for example, but they work, they look in a similar way as do classes from other object-oriented programming languages. What they allow me to do is create a class that has certain information of it, and then I can create other objects from that class without having to rewrite code over and over again. In this specific case, I'm going to say export default class game extends phaser.scene, and I got my curly braces. And this just says that I'm creating a new class. It's called game. I'm going to export it, which means I want to make it available for the rest of my project to use. And this class game extends an already existing class, which is called phaser.scene. Within this class, I need a constructor. And inside the constructor, I'm going to refer to that phaser.scene, the original class, by saying super. And I'm going to add a line of code that says key game. We'll see what that means in just a moment. Now, I'm going to go back to this index.js, and I'm going to copy all this stuff, or actually I'm going to Control X. I'm going to cut all this stuff, and I'm going to place it in the game.js underneath the constructor, but still within the class. And I'm going to hit save. And then something that I want to note is that because I have I'm now adding this image in this other file, not in this index.js, and they don't share the same directory structure, meaning that the games.js file is in the scenes folder whereas index.js is within the root source folder. I need to import this logo image from the assets folder before my code. And it's no longer, you might want to just do a quick Google search about how to reference whether you have a period or two periods. If you are saying /assets, that means I want you to find the assets folder that's in my current directory, which isn't the case. If you look to the left, I'm in the scenes directory. I need to go up one directory and then find the assets directory. So I'm going to say /assets, and then I hit save. Now, if I go back to my my window, I'm going to see an error. Preload is not defined at I'm looking at index.js on line 9. And that just means that in this index.js, again, I don't expect you to become an expert in Phaser during this tutorial, but just know that right now in this this scene key value pair, the value is an object that has preload equal to preload and create equal to create, which was in this file. That no longer exists. I have now moved this over to the game scene or the game module. So I'm going to just change scene to game, and I'm going to say at the top here, import game from ./scenes/game.js. So let's just see what just happened here. In the game.js file, I have created a class called game, uppercase game, that extends the phaser.scene class. And I've, most importantly, just copy and pasted the code that I had in my index.js file. And I have imported the image from the assets folder so that I can use it in this code. And when I export this class, that's an ES6 feature, me being able to just say export default class. Then in the index.js folder, it has become available it has become available for me to import. So I import that game class from ./scene/game.js, and the scene here is called game. When I save everything, go over to my my window, I see an issue here. I see game.js. I'm not able to use this function preload. That simply means in Phaser, there's some finicky things that you'll learn when you're working with specific frameworks. The syntax should just be preload and create. I save it, and now we have the same scene as we did before. We moved all of our code from the index.js to a separate scene, which is game.js, and everything works the way that it should have before. If we worked with Phaser before, we also have another function here, which is called update. We're not going to be using it here, but I'm a little OCD, and I want to make sure that I have everything, the whole scaffold that I need in my code for it to work. Yeah, that's my basic project, which is pretty cool. But let's say that I want to go a step further, and I don't want this Phaser image to just sit here on the screen. I want to make it interactive, and I want to do that in my game scene. Well, okay, we're going to do something else here. We're going to say in Phaser, the way that we do that is that we, when we add an image, we can chain a command saying we want to set it interactive. And then we're going to say this dot input dot set draggable logo. That's just the way that you are able to set things as draggable in your create function, which, as I mentioned, happens at the very beginning of the game. So if I saved it, and you'll notice that I can't, I'm trying to click and drag, I can't do it. That's because in Phaser you have to do a little bit more work to make that happen. And the way that you do that in Phaser is you have to reference the input system that Phaser has. And so I'll just say this dot input dot on drag function pointer game object drag x drag y. I want you to do this thing. You don't have to become an expert on this, but it just says, hey, input system, when I drag a specific game object and with a pointer, I want the game object x to equal the drag x and the game object dot y to equal drag y. So as my pointer moves and I have this drag x and y coordinate, I want the game object x and y coordinate to match them. So basically wherever I'm dragging the object, move the object to the same x and y coordinates of my pointer. Save everything and go back into this my website, which is already loaded for me, and now I can drag this to my heart's content. Pretty cool. Great. So that's all well and good, but I want you to imagine that you have another hundreds and hundreds of lines of code here in your game scene, which now we've just like traded our game scene for our index scene, or the other way around, and we're saying that like, okay, now we have a bunch of stuff in the game component, and it's getting messy here. Maybe I want to put all of my interactivity, all of my code that relates to interactivity into another file completely so that I don't have to think about it here in this code. well, that's where JavaScript ES6 classes come in handy as well, and allows us to keep not only a clean code structure, but also a clean file structure so that everything is contained in these reusable components that keep my mind free of all the clutter and keep my code free of all the clutter. And also importantly, if I'm working with other people on this project, we're not all working on the same file. We can be working on different files or different components, and it's easy for us to navigate between them and see the work that each other are doing. So I'm going to create a new folder in my source directory, which is called helpers. And in the helpers directory, I'm going to create a new file, which is called, let's call it dragmanager.js. And in this, I'm going to say export default class drag manager. Okay. And in this file, I'm going to navigate back to my game.js. I'm going to drag all this stuff. I'm going to let's leave the logo in there. Actually, yeah. Let's just drag all the interactivity aspect of it and move it into this dragmanager.js. I need to add a few things actually before we do. We're going to say constructor, and we're going to add, we're going to pass in scene and logo, and we're just going to paste this code for now. It's not going to work, but that's okay. This basically says that I have a default class. I want to export a default class called dragmanager. And the constructor for that class, we need to pass in a scene and a logo. The scene, as you remember, is just a component in Phaser that we, you can think of it as like a title screen versus your game screen versus different game worlds versus a pause screen versus a win screen. You'll have different scenes for each of these different things. And we're going to pass in a scene and a logo so that we can make that logo draggable and move it around the screen, similar to what we did in the game.js file. And I'm going to say here, I'm going to remove this this little chain command here, set interactive, save it, go back to the drag manager, and I'm going to say logo dot set interactive, and after I've exported this, I'll go into my game.js and I'll say import drag manager from helpers / dragmanager.js. Now there's a bunch of things wrong with this code, and we're going to take it one piece at a time to help us understand how to code this correctly, both in terms of syntax and in terms of scope. But let's keep going for now, and we'll say in this drag manager, I have all of this stuff in the drag manager, and I'm going to create a function out of this so that I am able to access it from my game.js. So I'm going to encapsulate all this stuff in something called this dot, let's say, drag logo equals function, and in that function we'll pass in a scene and logo. And I'm going to move all this code inside this function. And then I'm going to say in here, in the game, in the create function, instead of what we were doing was just calling those functions here, I'm going to say const drag manager, lowercase drag manager, equals new drag manager. And then I'm going to say drag manager. Remember, now we have a new version of that drag manager, an object that has been created from that class. And I'm going to say drag manager dot, what do we call this? Drag logo. And I'm going to pass in this and logo. And I'm going to save it. We're going to go to our website, and it's going to say, well, there are issues here. Can't resolve helpers drag manager.js because I don't know where it is. And I don't know where this stuff is. Let's see what we did here. We forgot to have a slash here. And now it loads. And it loads correctly, but it set draggable doesn't work. Cannot read property set draggable of undefined in the drag manager .js, and we'll see why that is. This has to do with the scope of the project. So what I want you to know here is that I've added this logo here, and then I'm calling this function from this other file called dragmanager.js. And I'm saying I create a new object called drag manager, lowercase drag manager. I equal it to a new drag manager that I created in this other file, in this other folder. And then I'm calling a function from that drag manager, and I'm passing into it this, which means this scene, and or this component, and the logo that I created. When I go to this dragmanager.js, I have the same code that I had in the other file, which is, this has tripped me up before, and it might trip you up, so that's why I'm showing it to you. I've passed in the scene and the logo, which is, as you'll recall in the game.js, is this and logo. And I'm saying this.drag logo equals function of scene and logo. And now I'm saying that I want to set that logo interactive, and I want to use this, I want to refer to this input, which worked before in my other file. Why isn't it working here? Well, that's because I need to say scene.input set draggable and scene input on drag. Then I have this this dragging function. That just means that in the game.js, I was able to say this because I'm talking about this particular scene, which in which I'm using the input system that Phaser has, that Phaser offers. But when I move to another file, I'm no longer in the scope of that code. I'm somewhere else, and Phaser doesn't know what this is at that point. That's why I pass in this particular scene. I pass it into this drag logo function, which is using that scene and using that logo to do the work that it needs to do. Now, when I go back to my my auto-reloaded website, I can move things around just as I was able to do before. And that's because I've used this export function that comes with, or export feature that comes with ES6. I'm using a JavaScript class called Drag Manager, and I'm accessing that class by importing it here in my game scene. One other thing that you might have heard of or seen as relates to ES6 is called arrow functions. That's just a simple way, a simpler syntax that you can use when you're writing your functions. For example, here I have this.drag logo equals function, and then I have the two parameters here, scene and logo, and then the curly braces. Instead of writing function, I could just write equals scene comma logo equals arrow and save it, and it does the same thing. That's what an arrow function is. It's just an easy way of writing your code. So now that I have a fully functioning game, as you could call it, where I just drag this logo around, I want to take a look at my code and just understand what we've done here again. We began with this index.js as our entry point, which had a bunch of code in it. We decided to move that into a different component or a different module, what's called a scene in Phaser, called game.js. And we moved all that code into it and exported it as a class that extends the phaser.scene class, and then imported that scene from the game.js file, which is in the scenes folder, so that we don't have to have all that code here in the index.js. Then we created a bunch of code in the game.js scene and decided to move that over into a helper called Drag Manager, which itself is a class that we're exporting. And we had to do a little bit of work to get this up and running so that we can then reference it here in game.js and use it so that it works the way that we want our game to work. I know this doesn't look like we saved that much code, but if you're working with a bunch of different components, let's say many different scenes, a title screen, a pause screen, a game screen, and you're working with a lot of different types of code and code blocks, like you have a lot of different interactivity, you have different characters, you have different stats that you need to keep track of. You can keep those all in different files in your helpers directory, in your scenes directory. You can keep all your assets in your assets directory and compartmentalize your code so that it's easier for you to keep track of and also easier for other people who you're working with to see your code and understand what you're doing and make changes to it if you want them to do so. But one thing we need to do to close this loop is go back to our GitHub project and notice that we've made a bunch of changes, and we want to push those changes up from our local repository to the remote repository. So I'm going to hit Control-C, which stops the web server, and if I go back to this this page, it will let you know that it has disconnected. And I'm going to say git status, and it says, well, hang on a second, there are some changes that are not staged for committing. That just means that our local repository is now different from the remote repository. So I'm going to say git add dash capital letter A, which means add all of the changes that have been made that I've been working on. And it won't tell you that it's done that, but it has done that. And then I'm going to say git commit dash M, and I'm going to say made changes to file structure using ES6 classes. That means, okay, I've added all of these changes to GitHub's staging area. I want to commit them, meaning the next time that I push to the cloud or to the remote repository, this is what I want you to push to that repository. And I'm adding a message that just reminds me or whoever's looking at this what it is that I've done with this particular commit. Hit enter. It'll do some work. And then finally, I'll hit git push. And then that will push all the changes that I made, or it will resolve the deltas from the local repository to the remote repository. So if I navigate to my remote repository, and let's say I look in my source directory, this is the way that it used to look like. Oh no, this is the way it looks like now, because as I clicked on it, it loaded the most recent version, and you can see 18 seconds ago it has pushed to the cloud, to the remote repository, all the changes that I've made with this note of what's been changed. You might run into some issues if you're trying to pull from the repository or push to it when there are unresolved changes between you. Let's say if you're working on different machines, or if you're collaborating with someone else, that's beyond the scope of this tutorial. But just know that there's a bit more to learn when it comes to GitHub. But in this video, we've looked at specifically how to clone a project from GitHub, how to make the necessary installations of dependencies within that project by using NPM or Node Package Manager, how to utilize ECMA script 6 or ES6 features to write more clean code and to structure your files and your folders accordingly. And then push all of your, add, commit, and push all of your changes from your local repository to the remote repository after, of course, creating a new remote repository, so that you can keep track of all of your code, all of the versions of your code, and not only back it up, but collaborate with others in a clean and an efficient manner. I hope this video has been useful and helpful for you in your development as a developer. If so, please like it and subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my books, and we'll have more for you soon.